Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. Tonight, we continue to track the leading international news story, the unfolding war in Ukraine. The first major conflict in Europe post-World War II continues to escalate. With Russian troops advancing into Ukraine's largest cities, the death toll already in the thousands, the West piling on punitive sanctions on Russia, and President Putin sounding a nuclear threat in retaliation. At least 1 million people have fled Ukraine in the week since Russia's invasion, and the United Nations estimates that more than 10 million people could be displaced. The war has already impacted the global economy, with oil prices touching $118 a barrel, the highest since 2013, and gas prices hitting a record high. It is disrupting supply chains and stock markets, adding to global inflationary pressure and making travel more difficult. On the 2nd of March, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to reprimand Russia over its invasion of Ukraine and demanded that Moscow stop fighting and withdraw its military forces. But with Russia as a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council, the UN cannot do much to stop the war. And neither have 2 rounds of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine produced a breakthrough. The war has come home to India as well. We had 20,000 Indian nationals in Ukraine, including 18,000 students. We have already lost 1 Indian student in Ukraine to the ongoing hostilities. The government has launched a massive evacuation plan, Operation Ganga, to bring back all the remaining Indians and deployed 4 senior ministers as special envoys to 4 neighboring countries bordering Ukraine to coordinate and oversee the evacuation process. We are also sending humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. So what next for the war in Ukraine? To explore the various facets of this increasingly dangerous crisis, I am joined by 2 outstanding experts. With me in the studio is Dr. C. Raja Mohan, one of the world's leading strategic thinkers and commentators. A contributing editor on international affairs for the Indian Express, he was the founding director of Carnegie India and director, Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, before taking up his current position as senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi. He is also the author of 6 books on various aspects of foreign policy. And joining us via video link from Mumbai is Mr. Amit Bhandari, senior fellow, Energy, Investment and Connectivity at Gateway House. The author of India and the Changing Geopolitics of Oil, he has nearly 2 decades of experience as a public policy researcher, an entrepreneur, and a financial analyst. Welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch, gentlemen. Let me begin with you, Raj.
Thank you.
The war in Ukraine has become a defining geopolitical moment, a battleground that is likely to shape the future security architecture of Europe. What are the core issues at stake for Russia and the West in this crisis?
Just a week before, that is, last week there was no war, and I think just before the war started, it looked like there was a big diplomatic moment to peacefully rearrange the European security order. That is, finding a way to integrate Russia into the security system. Because if you look at,
Russia
since the state system emerged in Europe, 1648, Russia was part of Russia was part of the great power system. It's really after the Bolshevik Revolution where Russia became at odds ideologically, not just a competing power, but a power that was ideologically and politically at odds with the rest of the system. Since then, it's been a difficult relationship between the Western Europe and Russia. And I think the pressure that he mounted by mobilizing troops, we had the Germans and the French going to Moscow, telling the President Putin that, look, let's think of a new way of rearranging security. And the Americans themselves, if you recall, in June last year, Biden, against all advice, went and met Putin in Geneva and said, look, I have problems in the Indo-Pacific. Why don't we work this out? So it'll be easier for me, that is for the US, to deal with China. So it seemed that the circumstances were propitious for an accommodation. What are the issues in accommodation? The nature of the Ukrainian state. How does it deal with Russian minorities? What is Ukraine's attitude to Russia and the West? And what are the various arms control, between the 2 sides? And how do you arrange a security system? I think, and all these, it seemed there was room for compromise. But I think by seeking something a lot more, I think all of us underestimated Putin's ambition, that he's seeking fundamentally to restoration, not just of the USSR that broke up in 1991, but reclaim a lot of the territories and a veto over a large part of Europe's security policies. And I think you can't undo 30 years of history, which is what he's trying to do. And I think that's what now makes it both sides in a difficult situation. But at the same time, Russia is a nuclear weapon power. So there has to be a way, diplomacy must be kept alive to at least pull back the rush to the precipice, if you will.
And what is at stake for the West?
No, for the West because both Germany, France, and the US, they had decided, look, an accommodation with Putin is good. But today, for the problem is, how do you get Putin off the ramp? Is he really open for negotiation? It's not clear. In fact, President Macron spoke to him 2 days ago, and again, Putin said, look, I want the whole of Ukraine. So he's not going to step back. So I think that leaves the West in a very difficult situation. They're not fighting directly. The Ukrainians are fighting on their own. So therefore, for them, at what point do they step in? And there is very little you can do against a nuclear weapon power if he continues to do so. So I think you're going to see a lot more destruction of Ukraine because the military superiority is with Russia. And I think for the West, the challenge is economic sanctions are fine, but how do you stop the carnage on the ground? There are no easy answers for the West either.
Amit, turning to you now. Russia's financial system has been hit by what is being described as a form of economic war by the West, targeting everything from freezing the overseas assets of Russian banks and businessmen to removal of selected Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system to export controls and bans on trade financing and overflights by Russian carriers. But it is also said that Russia has built a fortress economy to withstand sanctions, and it has a war chest of $630 billion. Will the fortress be breached by the mother of all sanctions?
So sanctions are like what you called sanctions in economic war, and they are like war in more than one way. They are very easy to impose. A war is easy to start, and they are very hard to undo. And going purely by historical track record, I would say that sanctions have rarely brought about a desired change in behavior, especially for a large country. At best, it is a device for political leaders to show that we are doing something without actually having to put people in harm's way. The other point you made was about Russia's war chest, and there are some restrictions which have been imposed on how Russia can use these funds. And at this point, we need some more clarity, but it does raise a very crucial question. If forex reserves of a country are dependent on goodwill of the US Federal Reserve, that doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence in the international financial system. I mean, a rules-based international order is something that has been talked about a lot. And if we want a rules-based order, there have to be some things which are clearly off limits. Given that Russia is a large and a resource-rich country, I think it is in a much better position to weather sanctions compared to smaller countries.
Raj, President Putin would have known the economic and political costs that a war would impose on Russia. Yet he went ahead with the invasion. 1 week into the war, how does his balance sheet look like to you?
Both Xi Jinping and Putin have been talking about how the West is in decline. If you read all their literature, it's been West is finished, internal quarrels, look at the United States, they can't even get a vaccination done. So this notion that somehow West is in decline and disarray. Europe and Russia were fighting, so they just, President Biden had pulled out of the United States in a very, shall we say, not a graceful manner from Afghanistan. So they, I think, probably was convinced that the West will not be able to get its act together. But what we've seen is a quite dramatic way in which the West has united because the kind of challenge he's presented in Europe. Second, I think he thought there would be limits on which the economic sanctions will be used. For example, Germany, when Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, Germany went ahead and signed the Nord Stream 2.
Yes.
So they were not, they said, okay, he's taken a bit of a territory, and then he sat on more territory in eastern Ukraine. But it was not big enough to go for the Brahmastra, if you will. But by saying what Putin is saying, look, I want the whole of Ukraine, and I want more in terms of the political arrangements in Europe, I think Europe now feels that they've woken up to say, look, this is just not acceptable. So 75 years of German pacifism, Germany was the most favorable to Russia. They had the sense of war guilt, so they didn't want to pick up any quarrel with Russia. Most of the business interests, the German business and the Russian market were made for each other. So Germany now stepped forward is going to spend 100 billion euros for defense. It is going to spend 2% of its defense, and it is willing to take pain because, as Amit pointed out, sanctions are not a one-way street. One of the principles of sanctions is, I hit you, then I'm hitting myself because I'm stopping business with you. But Germany is willing to take the cost, and Europe is willing to take the cost because the grave problem that Putin has presented them. And I think, so that probably underestimated. Third underestimation, I think, is the Ukrainian resistance. You've been saying Ukraine is not a nation. It never existed independently. And they can only be sovereign as part of me. I mean, I think this is an extraordinary claim. I mean, look, everyone knows Ukraine and Russia had a complex, interdependent history. But a nation that has already existed 30 years, and you tell them, you don't exist, I'm going to come and take you over. He thought probably it's just a cakewalk, but what he discovered is that there has been a significant resistance on their own. They're not getting, I mean, they're getting some help, but really no one else is sending troops. But I think that's where probably the first week he thought it will be quickly done and be put in a new guy as in charge of Ukraine and declare victory and get back. But now he's not there, so he's escalating using artillery, missiles, attacking large number of civilian facilities. So I think he's getting deeper in. But we can't forget that the military balance is still very much in Russia's favor. Resistance is great. So it is a matter of time that he might take control of a territory, but he's going to lose the people of Ukraine.
Amit, one item which has still not been directly sanctioned is oil, which would probably be the greatest sanction of them all, given that oil and natural gas exports constitute almost 40% of Russia's budget. But major Western oil companies like Shell and BP are pulling out of Russia, as you said, and Canada has said it will not purchase oil from Russia any longer. So how is this going to impact the oil and gas market globally? And do you think Russia can weaponize oil?
I mean, first of all, we are already starting to witness some impact on oil prices. So right now, many traders are afraid of picking up Russian oil cargoes. And given that global oil market is really tight at this point of time, prices have already reached $120 a barrel, a level which we haven't seen in a decade. And this disruption is not going to be there just for oil, but also for natural gas and a host of other commodities which come from Russia. I will point out two more issues which we also need to be cognizant of. Firstly, urea prices have tripled in the last 1 year, and the key raw material for urea is natural gas. And the global gas market is in a bigger turmoil than the oil market. Russia and Ukraine are both major wheat exporters as well. So if fertilizer is expensive, food is going to become even more expensive. The other part is that, yes, that Russia is dependent on oil and gas exports, but so is Europe dependent on cheap Russian energy. And you will note that sanctions on Russia are specifically designed to exclude the oil and gas exports of Russia, which are primarily to European nations. So one way to read the situation or the sanctions is that certain kind of trade with Russia, which is critical for European economies, is okay, but other kinds of trade which are not critical to Europe, let's put it bluntly, let's say defense exports from Russia to India can be sanctioned. Also, one other factor which has changed in the last 7 or 8 years is that the global push of clean energy has meant that less money is going into developing oil and gas resources for several years. And because of that, oil market is much more finely balanced or tight, as we call it in trade, today compared to any time in the last decade. So any small disruption is going to push up the prices. Even before the conflict started, oil prices were already at $90 a barrel. And you will recall that in 2019, when Saudi Aramco facility was hit by missiles, the spike in prices lasted barely for a few hours. So that is the difference between a well-supplied oil market which was there and a finely balanced market that we have now. Any disruption will have very severe price consequences.
Now, Raj, China and Russia will certainly be in a much tighter economic and political embrace post-Ukraine. But how does Beijing see this war in Ukraine?
No, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think if you remember, just as the beginning of February, on February 4th, you had Xi Jinping and Putin meet, and the whole world was dazzled by the agreement that they signed.
The 5,000-word document that they issued.
That here Russia and China were now allies, and the West was in a disarray. Therefore, you're going to have a whole new order built by them. But I think for the Chinese now, what has happened in Ukraine, I think it sets a mixed set of results. I think one it certainly weakens Russia, because if Russia is going to be isolated by the West, then they have to rely more on China. And Chinese are merciless, and a Russia that is weak would be at the Chinese mercy, and that they can say, look, they can set the terms for that relationship, and not just economic terms, that they would want Russia to do various things, so they will be in a commanding position, like Stalin was vis-a-vis Mao in 1949. Today, China is the bigger brother, and Russia, I think, is in the danger of becoming a junior partner to China. But at the same time, China has a huge market and engagement with the West. After all, Chinese economy is deeply tied to the West, with Europe and the United States. And if you see last week, just before the aggression, Chinese were talking about Nixon's visit to China 50 years ago, and how China and the US can get along even in spite of the differences. So they've been teasing the American financial sector, Wall Street, as well as the Silicon Valley. Look, come back, let's make money. We love you, kind of a message. So trying to tell the Americans, look, there is room for a compromise here between us. So they would also, I think, open the door to the West and say, look, okay, there is a Russia problem, but let's find a way to work together so that you focus on Europe, we can work together in Asia. But I think the problem is the Americans are playing it smart as well. They're telling China, look, you've seen us helping Russia now. We're going to be very hard. Your business interests in the West are going to be hurt. And second, they're saying, if you think you have ideas about doing something to Taiwan, just as you Russian friends try to do it in Ukraine,
yes,
that you can see what we can do. We can isolate you, we can punish you. And if Russian army, which has a long experience of fighting, can't handle Ukraine, don't think you can just walk into Taiwan and take over the place. So I think, that is the flip side for the Chinese, that there is, that the Russia has created a set of problems with them. On the one hand, their position vis-a-vis Russia will improve and with the Americans will improve, but at the same time, the costs of carrying the Russian burden is going to be quite a bit for China.
And plus the template now that the West is setting on Russia's war in Ukraine could be the template to be used in case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
Exactly.
Now, President Putin has placed his strategic forces, including nuclear weapons, on a heightened state of alert. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that if a third world war were to take place, it would involve nuclear weapons and be totally destructive. Now, why is Russia raising the nuclear threshold?
I think, look at Russia's economic situation. I mean, Russia is $1.6 trillion GDP, which is roughly half of India's size, is 1/10 of China's economy, 1/10 of European economy, and much smaller. American GDP is around $22-24 trillion. So what does Russia have? It has an army, which Putin has modernized, and it has nuclear weapons, lots and lots and lots of them, almost thousands of nuclear weapons. So this is where I think Putin's, part of his gamble was that he can ultimately use the nuclear leverage to force the West. Look, whatever you do to me, you can't attack me, right? I mean, if you have nuclear weapons, that Americans can talk all that they want, but they're not going to pick a physical fight, because the guy who has nuclear weapons. So he's saying, look, I still have this card. So you better come and give me what I want. This is a huge gamble, what he's trying to do, the threatening nuclear war. At the same time, this has consequences. Ukrainians see, look, if you had nuclear weapons, you wouldn't be in this trouble.
Which they gave up as part of the Budapest Memorandum.
Yeah. So there you have. So they have this question of renewed importance of nuclear weapons. In Europe, Germany and others are going to talk about US must share more of their nuclear capability with the European allies. So therefore, part of the German rearmament, which they've announced, would also be Europeans should have a more say in the use of American nuclear weapons in Europe. And in the East, our friends in Japan, Abe-san, now as a former prime minister, he declared that, look, Japan should consider hosting American nuclear weapons on its soil. Right. So everyone sees, look, if Russia and China enter this large expansionist mode, that they're going to take more territory, then the final defense against this is really nuclear weapons. So I think in many ways, the nuclear weapons are going to come back.
Amit, it is being said that as long as China is enabling currency transactions, financial transactions, and energy sales with Russia, it is going to mute the impact of Western sanctions. Can China bail out Russia? And will it?
Most of the global trade is conducted in the US dollar. And if a transaction is denominated in American dollars, it has to pass through the American banking system at some point. So sanctions mean that US persons and companies can no longer trade or facilitate transactions meaning American banks will no longer provide services for certain activities. If you do not conduct your transaction in dollars, if you do not touch the US banking system in your trade, say if you're conducting it entirely in another currency, you can continue to operate your trade. Now, I understand that a good chunk of the Russia-China trade is already being conducted in the yuan, and China is a major importer of resources, not just oil and gas, but all sorts of metals, nickels, cobalt, and other resources, and also exports a whole lot to Russia. So the trade is roughly balanced, making this kind of a transaction using yuan as the base currency quite possible. And China has already said that it doesn't recognize the sanctions on Russia. So increased exports to China will definitely help mitigate the impact of sanctions. So I would say that post these sanctions, Russia is going to be more economically dependent upon China. And given the Chinese need for natural resources, it is unlikely that China will stop purchasing these from Russia.
Let us now turn to the impact on India. Now, Amit, India has a $10 billion trade with Russia, and we export goods like pharmaceutical products, tea and coffee to Russia. Indian banks, led by the State Bank of India, have already indicated that they will not process any fresh transactions involving Russian entities because of the international sanctions imposed on Russia. So how will this impact India's trade with Russia? And would we need to revive the old rupee-ruble arrangement?
At this time, we still need some clarity on what is doable and what is not doable on the sanctions front. What happens very often with sanctions is that rather than run the risk of violating them inadvertently, a lot of companies and institutions simply refuse to have any business relations for the time being. So once there is greater clarity, we may find that a lot of transactions, and typically food products and pharmaceutical products, are excluded from most sanctions. So a lot of transactions will be possible. However, as I also pointed out earlier, that sanctions come very quickly and go away very slowly, if at all. And it is quite possible that depending on how the political situation evolves, the scope of sanctions can be expanded. This will also depend on how well Europe is able to reduce its dependence on Russian gas. Now, rupee-ruble mechanism can work only if India-Russia trade is balanced and both the currencies are reasonably stable. And at this point of time, the ruble is clearly very unstable. So any trade between India and Russia will have to be denominated in the Indian rupee. Now, in case of Iran, when we were conducting trade with Iran about 10 years back, India had designated UCO Bank, which doesn't have any exposure to the US, to hold Iranian rupee accounts in India and to pay this money out to Iranian traders for their purchases in the country. So this is something which we will also have to replicate, create a group of Indian institutions which can facilitate trade with Russia and which are not exposed to directly exposed to the Western financial system. India also needs to invest in equity of Russian resource companies. Now, most of these companies pay out substantial dividends, and this will generate a ruble income for Indian companies or Indian shareholders, reducing the imbalance that India has in its trade with Russia. And it will be especially useful in paying for the Russian military hardware, which India will continue importing for a very long time to come. Physical trading of oil on an Indian commodity exchange needs to start, in which oil is being denominated and traded in the Indian rupee.
He's making some very interesting points. Raj, you want to come in?
Look, I think because you've been in the government for so many years, that India is very risk averse. That when they run sanctions, we didn't try to circumvent the sanctions or seen as breaking the sanctions. While our Chinese friends and the Russians could do it they had the clout, so they could do it with Iran. But India stayed on the right side, despite all the criticisms, both internally and externally, that you're not willing to take needless risks in just keeping up a trade relationship with Iran. So I think we also have to put the Russian trade in the larger context. At this point, if India's total trade this year, 2021 is expected to be around $1.3 trillion. $1.3 trillion. Out of which 10 billion is Russian trade. So I think if energy is excluded, I don't know how that actually plays out. So some of it is secure. If some of the other food items are excluded, it's taken care of. So I don't think given the scale of the problem, sustaining the Russian economic relationship is such a major priority, I would think. Your problem is on the defense side, actually. What do the sanctions do? Yesterday in the US Congress, they were saying, look, the sanctions are going to make it very hard for India to import weapons from Russia. We already have the sword hanging on the India's purchase of S-400 missiles. So for us, I think that will be the priority. Given you have a problem with China, which is sitting on your borders, they can ramp up the temperature anytime. And we are dependent on Russia to deal with that problem. So therefore, how do you do that? I mean, I would think in pure strategic terms, I'm not underestimating the importance of the economic thing, but the scale of the economic thing is not such a gigantic thing. We are not like Germany, had $60 billion of trade, and we have barely 10. So I think our problem would be manageable on the commercial side, I think.
Okay, turning now to the political side. So far, India has taken the middle path on the Ukraine crisis, calling for respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, while emphasizing the need for legitimate security interests of all parties to be protected. Our preferred course of action has been to abstain at the United Nations. Is it the right strategy? And what policy options does India have?
Not too many. I think India is not looking, I mean, in the bar of the public opinion, both in Europe and North America, a lot of people are saying, look, how can India be a great power if it can't take positions on major issues? It's all about themselves, that they have a problem with Russian weapons, they have students caught up, but do they take any positions at all? I mean, why is it India can't even say the aggression is bad? Now there, I think, Indian government has a case that, look, we're not in a beauty contest. It's not for others to judge us that we have equities in Russia. Just as Amit pointed out, Europeans are protecting their energy lifelines from Russia. So India would want to protect its defense lifeline and what little it can salvage on the commercial side. So therefore, the problem for India is that, look, you can explain this as long as we are clear. We're not justifying Russian intervention. We're not supporting the intervention. We're not kind of trying to circumvent the international sanctions. And we've seen some adjustment in the Indian position from day one, where we call for restraint on both sides, to talking about being deeply disturbed by the aggression, then talking about territorial sovereignty and integrity, which is like what Russia has done. If on Kashmir and other issues, that directly hits our interest. So finally, we've said something on that. We're also saying, look, it's not just a question of legitimate interests of all parties, that there is a crisis here. And India has also done a little bit on the humanitarian side with the Ukrainians. So I think we are making the adjustments. And if the situation gets worse, and if the Russian tactics are going to be brutal in Ukraine, it's going to be very hard for India, I think, to be seen as justifying. You can say, look, we have a problem, but that doesn't mean we're going to just keep quiet. So I think there'll be a lot of fine walking the tightrope you're going to see in the next few days. But I think so far, I think we've navigated this.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for allowing us to see clearly through the fog of war. As the military conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate, marking the worst fracture between East and West since the Cold War, there is a lot at stake for India and the world. We can only hope that India's call for an immediate ceasefire and for diplomacy and dialogue to resolve this crisis is heeded. But whichever way this war turns out, it is clear that the world will not be the same again. That is all I have for you on this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Join me again next week for a new dispatch from the front lines of foreign affairs. Till then, good evening and goodbye.